Iranian forces just tried to stop and board a U.S. tanker in one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. And what happened next could have major consequences for global trade. Welcome back to another episode of Shipping News Today. I'm your host, and we've got quite a situation to talk about today. So there was this incident in the Straits of Hormuz recently, and honestly, it's pretty serious. Iranian forces decided to approach a U.S. tanker out there, and well, things got tense for a bit. Now, this isn't just some random event. It's actually connected to bigger tensions happening right now in that whole area. And you know what? It affects way more than just American ships. We're talking about tankers, container ships, and cargo vessels from all over the world that pass through there every single day. So let me walk you through what happened. This story comes from maritime reporter Mike Schurz. Earlier this week, a merchant tanker was going through the Straits of Hormuz when Iranian forces showed up and started hassling them. And get this, the ship involved was the Stena Imperative, which is actually a really important vessel. It's part of something called the U.S. Tanker Security Program. You might remember hearing about the Stena Imperative before. Just recently we covered another incident involving its sister ship, the Stena Immaculate. That one had some kind of close call with another vessel called the Salon. Anyway, here's how it all went down. According to maritime operations out of the United Kingdom, this merchant ship got approached by several small armed boats around 9 in the morning on February 3rd. They were in the inbound traffic lane, maybe 16 miles or so north of Oman. Later on, the U.S. military confirmed it was indeed the Stena Imperative. This is a U.S. flagged tanker that carries crude oil and petroleum products, operated by Crowley Maritime and Stenabulk. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The U.S. Central Command said that 2 fast attack boats from Iran's Revolutionary Guard came racing toward the tanker at high speed. They also had a drone overhead. And they actually ordered the tanker to stop its engines. They even threatened to board the ship and take it over. Now if I were on that ship, I'd tell them absolutely not and keep right on going. There's just no way I'm stopping a U.S. flagged vessel for them. And you know what? That's exactly what the crew did. The tanker actually sped up and kept moving forward. Smart move if you asked me. Luckily, there was a U.S. Navy destroyer nearby, the USS McFall. They moved in to escort the tanker, and after that, the whole situation calmed down pretty quick. A security expert named Martin Kelly said this was basically Iran showing off in the Straits of Hormuz. He pointed out that while Iranian forces do hail ships in that area fairly often, everything feels a lot more serious right now because of recent events. And yeah, he's right about that. This all goes back to an earlier incident where an Iranian drone was heading toward the USS Abraham Lincoln, and U.S. Navy jets had to shoot it down. Now, the Stena Imperative isn't just your average commercial tanker. This ship is special. It's one of 10 U.S. flagged tankers in a program run by the Maritime Administration. These ships are basically on standby to help the Department of Defense with fuel needs during emergencies. Last summer, the crew actually completed some pretty advanced training. They got certified to do ship-to-ship refueling while both vessels are moving. That's a really complicated operation, and it's become super important lately. Especially after the Navy had to close down that big fuel storage facility in Hawaii called Red Hill. So timing-wise, this incident is interesting. It happened just days before the US and Iran were scheduled to sit down for talks about nuclear stuff. And there's been a lot of military activity in the region recently, partly because Iran had some pretty harsh responses to protests in their country last month. The president even made a statement saying things could get really bad if those talks don't go well. Now, Iran has been pushing back against U.S. naval presence near its waters. And let me show you something really interesting here. This chart from Ian Ellis over on X gives you a clear picture of just how much military power is actually in that region right now. You can see the Abraham Lincoln Battle Group positioned just outside the Straits of Hormuz, along with several American destroyers scattered around the area. There are also multiple military Sealift Command replenishment ships there. The Karl Bashir and the Kaiser are both in position. And if you look inside the Gulf itself, there are several littoral combat ships along with a destroyer. That destroyer is the McFall, The same one that came to escort the Stena Imperative. But here's the really important part. There's a massive amount of air power that's been moved into this region. You can see all the capabilities they have, including Tomahawk strike missiles and tons of aircraft positioned throughout the area. Now let me pull up marine traffic for you. This map shows all the US-flagged commercial vessels in and around that region. The Straits of Hormuz that you see up here is one of the world's most critical shipping bottlenecks. About a fifth of the entire global oil supply passes through there. Pretty incredible when you think about it. When we zoom in closer, you can actually see American ships moving in and around the area. For example, right here you've got the Mark Saratoga heading outbound through the Straits of Hormuz. You can spot several other vessels too. There's the APL Eagle, and over here near Bahrain, you can see the Stena Imperative itself. There's also the Liberty Glory and the Torm Thunder, which is another one of those tanker security program vessels. Further up in the Persian Gulf, you've got the Maersk Yorktown. But it's not just US ships in this area. The Straits of Hormuz is actually one of the most congested shipping zones in the entire world. You can see right here just how packed it gets with ships moving through constantly. And when we overlay the nautical chart on top of this, you can really see the traffic lanes clearly. That northern lane that brings shipping from outside the straits into the Persian Gulf passes incredibly close to Iran. Like, really close to their major naval base over at Bandar Abbas. So what does all of this actually mean for commercial shipping? Let's dig into a couple of stories here. There's a report from Reuters with the headline about the president telling Iran to make a nuclear deal or face serious consequences. We saw those attacks on Iran earlier this year. They were pretty devastating, honestly. Iran really didn't have much ability to stop the strikes that targeted their nuclear infrastructure. And now there's similar pressure being applied again. So this action by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was probably their way of pushing back against that American pressure. Kind of a show of force, you know? Now Iran has responded to all this. Another story from Reuters talks about how Iran's leadership warned on Sunday that there could be regional conflict if the US were to attack them. That definitely raises the tension between Washington and Tehran even more. And they also went ahead and designated EU armies as terrorist groups. I've heard a lot of different things said about EU armies over the years, but terrorist group is definitely a new one. The US has really ramped up its naval presence in the Middle East, as we just saw on those maps. And despite this whole standoff between Iran's government and the current US administration, both sides have actually said they're willing to sit down and talk. Regional allies like Turkey have been trying to calm things down and get everyone to de-escalate. Interestingly, an Iranian official came out and denied an earlier report from state-run press that the Revolutionary Guard's naval force was going to conduct live exercises in the Straits of Hormuz. That harassment we talked about earlier, it all happened over VHF Channel 16. And you know what's impressive? The US destroyer and air cover showed up almost immediately. Like, the ship had an escort incredibly fast. We also got this story from January 31st that's pretty interesting. There was an explosion that hit a building in the southern Iranian port of Bandar Abbas on a Sunday. According to their preliminary assessment, Iranian state media said it was caused by a gas leak. At least 2 people were killed and 14 others were injured in that blast. Now, you've got to admit, that's a pretty weird coincidence. You have this massive explosion happen in Bandar Abbas at the exact same time all of this other stuff is going on. Kind of makes you think, right? Before that, there was this story from Bloomberg talking about the Lincoln Strike Group arriving in the area. It also discussed how the messaging has been shifting about goals in the region. Things like removing Iran's leaders, punishing the regime for how they handled those protests, and trying to get a new nuclear agreement. Although they've kind of stepped back from the whole regime change talk lately. But one of the most interesting parts of all this has to do with oil prices spiking this week. Brent crude went up almost 6% to around $70 a barrel. And you've really got to look at what's happening with Venezuelan oil, Iranian oil, Russian oil, and OPEC oil all at the same time. I mean, there's just no way these issues aren't all connected somehow. Now, as if that wasn't enough happening in the Straits of Hormuz, guess who's back? Our friends the Houthis have apparently risen from the dead again. This time there's a story about how maritime shipping was considering a careful return to the Suez Canal after 2 years of avoiding the Red Sea. But now there's this dangerous combination of Houthi warnings and U.S. military buildup that threatens to mess up the industry's fragile hopes for getting some stability back in one of the world's most important waterways. According to Martin Kelly, that same security expert from earlier, the Houthi forces have really ramped up their propaganda operations. They've been putting out new video footage showing attacks against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The only caption they used was just the words soon. Okay, I'm not going to play another one of their propaganda videos. Honestly, I just cannot deal with their music anymore. It's too much. It's genuinely too much to have to listen to over and over again. But Kelly went on to say that multiple pro-Houthi figures shared the video and claimed they would stand alongside Iran if there's a US or Israeli strike. So yeah, that's concerning. At the same time, we have this other story from Mike Schurz about a US-India trade deal that could completely redraw global oil flows and tanker demand. This newly announced trade agreement between the United States and India could seriously reshape how crude oil moves around the world. It might even cut Russian seaborne oil exports by as much as 25%. Think about that for a second. The deal was announced on a Monday. It would lower U.S. tariffs on Indian goods to 18% from 50%. And in exchange, India would stop buying Russian oil and commit to purchasing more than $500 billion worth of U.S. energy and other products over the coming year. According to the chief shipping analyst at BIMCO, a guy named Niels Rasmussen, the implications for maritime trade could be pretty substantial. This new trade agreement could put an end to that whole Russian oil trade with India. Man, you've got the Houthis, you've got the Russians, you've got the Indians. This is geopolitical risk in full action right here. It's all happening at once. And not to be outdone, we got this story from Bloomberg. Global container shipping lines are bracing themselves for lower profits in 2026. They're worried because a potential reopening of the Red Sea shipping route could put pressure on freight rates. That would make the oversupply issues even worse and really mess with trade plans. Major shipping companies like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, NYK, OCL, and COSCO Shipping are all expected to report weaker earnings in 2026. And this comes after an already tough 2025 that was marked by all that tariff chaos. If traffic starts going back through the Red Sea, it would make the existing oversupply problems even worse. Analysts at Bank of America talked about these structural overcapacity issues. Okay, Bank of America, I'm not totally sure I'm going to take their word on everything, but they might have a point here. We also have this story from Bloomberg about U.S. container imports. They ended 2025 in a 4-month slide, and it's probably going to get worse this year as trade shifts to other economies trying to dodge those tariffs. Inbound volumes in December dropped 6.4% from the year before, down to 1.9 million container units. That followed a 5.7% drop the month before, according to data from John McCown. Now I know John pretty well, but his numbers don't quite match up with what we saw coming out of Descartes. They had it at over 2 million containers and actually showed 2025 ending just 0.4% lower in container imports compared to the previous year. John's showing a bit more of a loss here. He goes on to say the downward trend in 2025 was mostly due to tariffs, which isn't really surprising. Unfortunately, there's nothing right now that suggests this is going to turn around quickly. Then our friend Mike Schurz has this article about global container shipping rates. They've been declining for a third straight week now with weakening demand ahead of Chinese New Year. The Drewry World Container Index fell 5% to $2,117 per 40-foot container. That drop was driven mostly by sharp declines on the Trans-Pacific and Asia-Europe routes. Spot rates from Shanghai to New York slid 7%. Shanghai to LA dropped by 4%. Drewry said freight rates are likely to stay under pressure in the coming weeks. According to Drewry's Container Capacity Report, carriers have announced 63 blank sailings for February. Those are cancelled sailings, by the way. That's up sharply from 27 in January. Now, that's not actually too surprising because of when the Asian New Year happens. We see everything basically shut down for about 2 weeks during that time. But the increase in cancelled sailings shows that carriers are still heavily relying on capacity management to try to support freight rates while cargo demand stays weak. I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. The fact that the Houthis are making noise again actually makes many shipping lines happy. But they will never openly admit that because it gives them a reason to keep going around south of Africa, keeping capacity on charter, and more importantly, keeping those rates up. Then you get this story from Schurz about Ocean Network Express. That's one. They slipped into the red in the first quarter of fiscal year 2025, reporting a net loss of $88 million on revenue of $4.07 billion. Persistent overcapacity and softer demand really weighed on the container markets. The Singapore-based carrier said results for the October through December period were hurt by continued new ship deliveries that kept fleet supply ahead of demand, even as cargo volumes cooled across major trade lanes. Alright, so you have too many ships. Whose problem is that? It's not the shippers' problem. It's the ocean carriers. They've got too much capacity. They need to bleed off that capacity. They need to sell ships. Scrap them. The problem is they're just not doing it right now. And again, what we're going to see here is those freight rates continuing to drop. But I guarantee you will see a spike toward the end of February, early March. Just watch. Typically what we see with cargo containers is a big spike coming into the second quarter, March and onward. And just to show you how confusing all of this really is, here's a story about the Gemini Alliance. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd are testing the Red Sea waters as their Mi-11 service makes a return. So Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd just announced their first real return to the Red Sea. Starting in mid-February 2026, the Mi-11 service is going to resume going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Westbound sailings will kick off with the Albert Maersk departing from Mundra on February 4th. Meanwhile, eastbound trips began with the Estrid Maersk sailing from Valencia on February 3rd. For shippers using Mi-11, the improvements are significant but they vary. Westbound transit times from Salalah to Port Said will be cut by 19 days. Eastbound voyages from Valencia to Salalah will be shortened by 7 days. Both carriers made it clear that safety isn't negotiable. Any further changes depend on how things go. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd said that any additional Gemini services will only shift back to the Red Sea if the situation stays stable and regional tensions don't get worse. Now, these aren't the big ships. These aren't those massive container liners we usually talk about. The ships in question here, like the Albert Maersk and the Estrid Maersk and the Maersk Cleveland, these are smaller vessels. When ships like the Maersk Sealtar and the Maersk Denver went through, those were also smaller ships. And we actually did a whole video on the Maersk Denver going through because she was a US-flagged vessel. Lastly, let's talk about the bulk trade for a minute. Longer sailing distances are set to boost dry bulk demand through 2026, according to BIMCO. The shipping analyst manager at BIMCO said they estimate that the dry bulk supply-demand balance will stay stable in 2026 and then weaken a bit in 2027. An improvement in the economic and demand outlook led them to revise their 2026 demand forecast upward. BIMCO's upward revision reflects a more positive global economic outlook. The IMF is now forecasting GDP growth of 3.3% in 2026. Growth is expected to hold steady compared to 2025 before easing slightly to 3.2% in 2027. When we talk about dry bulk, we're talking about grain. We're talking about ore, we're talking about any kind of solid material that gets loaded onto ships. So the harassment of the Stena Imperative by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is part of this larger geopolitical situation. It has to do with the positioning and movement of naval forces and air forces into the region by the United States, the EU, and various other nations. But at the same time, the warnings from the Houthis and all these issues are being felt across every major sector in shipping. We're seeing it affect tankers. We're seeing it in containers. And we're seeing it in bulk carriers too. It's a lot going on. There's a lot happening in the world of shipping right now. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell so you get alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you want to support the channel, how do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next episode, thanks for watching.